Today I'm interviewing Dr. Robert Trager. Welcome to the show, sir. Good to have you here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for
Yes.
inviting me.
And you're all the way over across the pond somewhere in Oxford, are you?
In Oxford,
In
that's right.
Oxford. All right. I was going to go through your bio here, sir. Co-director of the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative, International Government's lead at the Center for the Governance of AI and senior research fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. You're a recognized expert in the international governance of emerging tech, diplomatic practice, institutional design, and tech regulation, and you regularly advise government industry leaders on those topics. Now, from 2017 to 2021, you were Assistant Director for Research at the Burkle Center for International Relations, Associate Editor of one of the international relations field's leading journals, the International Studies Quarterly, and sat on the boards of the Institute for Global Cooperation and Conflict, the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab, and the Burkle Center. Now, before you went to Oxford, you were professor of poli-sci, political science at UCLA. Are you a Rams fan, by the way?
Uh, I'm not a Rams fan, not at
Oh,
all. No,
too bad.
sorry. Is that a strike against?
Well, as a Canadian, I've been a Rams
Ah,
fan since I was in grade 3. So,
yeah.
but
Oh,
that,
interesting.
that's okay. We can forgive you for that. That's not a problem. Um, You held faculty positions at Yale and the Olin Fellowship at Harvard. My old alma mater for my postdoc was at Harvard. Your research focuses on economic models of technology, races, and regulation and industry cooperation for the public benefit in safety critical industries. Now, before 2022, you focused mostly on international relations and peace studies with a heavy empirical approach, and you applied game theory, which I'm excited to talk about, and data collection to propose hard solutions to political and diplomatic challenges. And in this period, you wrote your most cited works to date, Deterring Terrorism, The Political Costs of Crisis Bargaining, Diplomatic Calculus in Anarchy. And you published 2 books, which also fall under that theme, Diplomacy, Communication and the Origins of International Order, and The Suffragist Peace, How Women Shape the Politics of War. So that's quite the CV, sir. Now, you're at Oxford. Your research appears to have taken on kind of a new direction in 2022, where you started to think a lot more about AI. And was the cause of this, and was this a continuation of what you had done prior, a shift in focus, something in between? Can you speak at all about how your previous work led you to thinking about AI and emerging technologies?
Yeah, it was a transition for me. I date it to the very end of 2019. That was really when I started to refocus.
Mm.
And in 2022, something started to come out, but I really started then. And I would say there were a couple of big events and factors. The first was in 2016, the AlphaGo
Mm.
moment with Google DeepMind, where they showed that it wasn't just about chess anymore. You could have a computer that could beat the leading player in Go, which previously was thought to be absolutely impossible. And I knew enough about that area to understand what a significant moment this was. And it made me think immediately that we were going to have AI that was doing creative things and doing all sorts of things that previously AI hadn't at all been able to do.
Mhm.
And so that was a moment for me. And it was also a moment for a friend of mine who is called Alan Defoe. And he immediately reoriented his research in 2016, and he tried to convince me to do the same, but he didn't convince me right away. I thought, he told me this is the important thing to work on. And I thought, yeah, this is probably maybe the most important thing to work on, but other people are better positioned to do it. And I have a research agenda and I have other things that are also important that I should be doing. And then another thing happened in 2019 where I talked to a lot of the people in the area.
Mhm.
And when I talked to them, I found that there were lots of smart people and they were so interesting to talk to, but I found that I disagreed with them about some things related to politics. And so that was sort of a moment for me because Alan had already convinced me that the area was important, but I thought, well, I'm not sure that I'm the one who has the most to contribute. Maybe somebody else should do it.
Right.
But then when I realized that I actually disagreed with some things I was hearing from people who were in the space, and then I sort of thought, all right, I have to do this. So then I changed then.
Okay. And what were some of the things that you were finding disagreement with?
Well, people were saying things like, it was really a range of things, but people said things like, well, we don't think we can solve international politics, so we just have to think about technological solutions to the problems of technology. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit,
Yeah.
but there were a lot of things that were in that vein,
Mhm.
and I just thought, I know, I really just disagreed. And it was such a, for me, there was so much more to be said. There were so many other options besides sort of figuring out how to have the nations of the world be perfectly Pacific, that I thought we really needed. And the way I see it, there's often a kind of a competition, almost a horse race between a technological solution and a social solution. And sometimes you have one and you have a technological solution. Often the technological solution is the easier one. You can do that. Maybe, I don't know, you can tell me where to go, but I think it's interesting. I'll just tell you quickly a story about lead poisoning from gasoline.
Mhm.
That was a fascinating one because you're poisoning untold numbers around the world with the lead in gasoline. And people started to realize this. And then they thought, what should we do? And there was a social solution, which was we're going to have to not have lead in gasoline. We're going to have rules against that. And that was obviously hugely costly. That was going to require different sorts of engines and all sorts of different production processes. And so people hoped for a technological solution. There was a time period there where they thought, let's not have the social solution. Let's just have a cap at the end of the exhaust pipe, and we'll just catch the lead there. And so they
Interesting.
thought, let's just catch it. And of course, it didn't work. That's the thing, so you delayed the social solution, which we had to get to, and you can
Yeah.
assign, a number of people who were severely harmed by this hope
Hmm.
for a technological solution. Now,
Hmm.
if it had worked out, it would have been great, perhaps,
Hmm.
but it doesn't always. So I think, we sort of need to have both of those. And that's essential. I think
For
across all
sure.
areas, we need to have,
For sure. That's an
yeah,
interesting example. Uh, Neil deGrasse Tyson does a good job on that in the reboot of Cosmos, um, where he talks about the scientist who figures that out, that the lead poisoning is happening, and
oh
he
yeah,
realizes we've got to be able to stop this. So
yeah,
it was a fascinating thing to see. When you
yeah,
mention Go as a kind of a turning point, that's something that kind of caught your attention. Is it
yeah,
because, and I talked to Steve Omohandro about this as well, is it because Go is just vastly more complex than chess? And it's like one thing to beat a chess master like Kasparov or something like that, but Go, man, that's got far
yeah,
more parameters and it's far more difficult
yeah.
for a machine. Was that it, that it just scaled up so much?
I I think, there are nuances here, but there's, I think, a really simple way to look at this,
Hmm.
which is that at any point on a chessboard, you have a really simple heuristic for
Right.
saying who's winning and who's losing. And that's just you assign value to the pieces
Hmm.
and you add them up. Who's got more value in the pieces? And maybe you can do more than that and other things, but even if you just did that, you can do really well and beat the best human players. And so what you can do is you just search ahead. you just think a certain number of moves ahead, and you think about every possible move that could happen a certain number of moves ahead, and
Mhm.
then you evaluate, well, which one of those is the best for me being the computer
Yeah.
in this case. And so you have that, and that's, loosely speaking, what people were doing with chess.
Right.
But with Go, you don't have this heuristic to say for any board state who is winning and who's losing. And so you didn't have all this knowledge that you could easily impart to the system.
Hmm.
You actually had to have a system that was going to learn for itself what the right things to do were, and a system that then evolved things that and strategies that nobody knew to put into the system. And so in this sort of environment that was complicated in this particular way, and that it was difficult to say what the kind of reward function is, we didn't really have a way of beating even pretty good humans with a
Hmm.
computer for a long time. We could do it with chess for ages. We could beat the best humans when we couldn't even beat a pretty good human with Go. And then suddenly that changed with AlphaGo.
Sure did. And then beat Ken Jennings on Jeopardy, and then did a lot of other stuff
Yeah, yeah.
as well. So now you often mention increasing risks with AI. Correct me if I'm wrong. You tend to place a bit of like less of an emphasis on existential risk and the development of AGI, and more on things like laws or what's called lethal autonomous weapon systems, or frontier models, disaster instead of AGI, and existential risk. Um, what sorts of risks do you feel right now at this particular point in time in early 2024? What risks do you see as being the most imminent and urgent? Um, and do you see a need for um, governance and legislation to happen sooner rather than later?
I really think we have a lot of things to worry about. Some things that are very concrete, that are real harms to real people today. We need to do something about those things. We really do.
Okay.
And worries about things that sound like science fiction shouldn't be seen as distracting from those things. We simply need to do those things. But I actually think some things that seem like science fiction or seem like it a really short time ago,
Hmm.
um, are real now, or potentially real. Convincing to me. I was on a recent trip to China with some of the leading AI scientists, and we were talking there about catastrophic risks from AI, and in particular loss of control risks. And I it seems pretty likely to me that we'll have. I mean, I guess I feel like we already have loss of control risks. We have them in the area of lethal autonomous weapons, for instance. I mean, it's very likely that if we built a system, as militaries are, that could go around and select its own targets, that it's not always going to distinguish between civilian and military in
Right.
selecting a target. That's a loss of control because you want it. Maybe the people that make it and deploy it, they'd like it to just target the military, but it's not doing that. And so that's like, the kind of loss of control that we already certainly see. And it seems pretty clear that as we make systems that are more agentic, which I think is coming really soon,
Hmm.
that's what a lot of labs are working on. So we're going to have systems that are more agentic in that way, more autonomous.
And let me just stop you there. By agentic, you mean, like for our listeners and for our viewers, when you say
Yeah,
agentic, an agent, it's
an
acting like.
agent. It's going to be an agent. Yeah, it's going to be an agent. I mean, a lot of it's going to be, you're going to be able to say, do this thing for me,
Mhm.
and it'll have a little bit of planning ability and a little bit of ability to do things in the world, and it'll go off and do that. Um, but the technology is advancing, and so it's getting more and more abilities, more and more planning abilities, more and more ability to go and do things on its own. And as it does that, I think we need to take seriously the range of things that could happen.
Right.
And so, I just think we, I don't want to talk about prioritizing, risks, because people really get hot under the collar about these things.
Mhm.
And to be honest, I run an institute at the University of Oxford, and our idea is that we should be broad. We should be worrying about all the risks that we need to worry about. That includes some things that used to sound like science fiction, and includes other things that are very real and present harms today, that are easier to characterize. And all of these things are important. That's what we want to do. We
Mhm.
want to solve all the problems.
Mhm.
We don't want to fight about which of the problems are a little more important than the others.
Right. Now, I'm currently finishing up writing a book that's called Building a God. And I'm convinced that big tech and probably a number of other countries are racing ahead trying to develop what's called AGI, or artificial general intelligence. Right now we have ANI, or artificial narrow intelligence. So it does what we tell it to do. Your Roomba isn't going to want to stop suddenly and want to become an accountant, or, change
Used
its
to
mind.
terrify my dog in the
Yes,
room.
exactly. So right now we have lots of narrow forms of artificial intelligence out there, and autonomous vehicles will be like that, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But the holy grail right now in artificial intelligence seems to be the first ones who will develop something that can think more like a human and can think more laterally. And so AGI is, to me, this kind of godlike level of intelligence, because it will have greater intelligence than all of us combined. It'll have access to huge amounts of data. It'll have computing power that we have never seen before. Do you see this possibly leading to the use of hostile countries in the world, uh, maybe developing it to further geopolitical ideologies? Do you worry about that at all?
Oh, I worry about that a lot. I mean, what I worry about, I think we don't know when something like AGI is coming. We don't know.
Right.
Some smart people think it's coming in a couple of years, and other people who are very knowledgeable think that some of the kind of so-called scaling up that we've been doing, where we throw more computed data at the problem, that's going to kind of plateau, and we're not going to make so much progress with that anymore. And we don't know which one of those views is right. I
Do you
remember
think
what I
do you
once
think
said.
do you think
Uh,
China or North
I,
Korea or
let me,
Iran, if they got a hold of this technology, would they use
yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think so. I think this is a really interesting question. So, one question is, what are the risks that
Mhm.
are associated with these kinds of technologies? And there's not agreement on that.
Right.
So we don't have everybody saying, "Oh, yes, if you cross this particular line, then something really bad is going to happen." So we don't have that right now. Even if we did have that, I'm still worried,
Mm.
because one issue is, well, is there going to be a line that everybody agrees, all right, go past this, then it's disaster.
Yeah.
That's kind of in a way, that's a good situation, because nobody wants disaster. Nobody goes over that line. But I think the more likely situation is that it's more like a gradient descent, a sort of a slippery slope. So
Mm.
it's not just disaster when you go across a line. It's, well, when you go down a path, it gets a little more risky. And that's really worrying, because then you have these competitive dynamics between all these different nations, whereby one says, oh, well, I'm sure my adversaries are going to go a little bit down this path to get an advantage. So I better go a little bit down this path. That doesn't mean there's a race to the bottom, but it means there's a certain amount of risk taking.
There is.
Yeah. And that's what I worry about, because
Yeah.
I'm expecting a certain amount of risk taking along those lines.
Mhm. Irving John Good, who worked with Turing, cracking German codes, back in the days of Bletchley Park, he said a super intelligent computer will be the last machine man ever needs to invent because it's going to answer so many of our questions.
Yeah.
That appears to be the holy grail of AI.
Yeah.
Do you think we should be putting safeguards up? Do you think we should be monitoring success rates? Do you think people should have to report when they come across new developments that might be indicating that we're getting close to AGI? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need all those things, and I think governments have to be involved. It
Mm,
should not be a set of folks in a private company that are making these decisions that affect, not just everybody in one state, but people around the world. And so I think we need governance processes at the national level, but
mm.
also at the international level. And that's really complicated to think about
It is. It is.
how should we
Back
do
in the
that?
90s, I was working on a project. Essentially, I wanted to build this thing before anybody else because I thought, well, I'm a professor of ethics and critical thinking. I'll know how to control this thing better than anyone else.
That's what everybody thinks.
I
Everybody I talk to says some version of that.
know,
Oh,
right?
I don't trust those other guys to do it, but I think I can get it done.
Yeah, I know. I know. Now, you and I are talking about something that the majority of the world doesn't yet know is happening. And I'm predicting that we may see a kind of a global angst like we did once the bomb was invented and then Russia had it, right? And then the Cold War began and people were nervous about could they drop the bomb? Is it possible? And so there was that kind of Cold War angst about fear of the bomb. Do you think something similar is going to happen once people start to understand what these big tech companies are trying to accomplish? Do you think that will play into a socio-technical result of what's happening in the world right now?
Yeah, I think there's already a good amount of sort of technology dread out there. I think people are worried. People have an idea that, wait a minute, technology just used to seem like something that was just taking us to great places,
Right.
and they don't feel that way anymore. And a ton of movies actually have a kind of AI takeover theme.
They do.
So I think on the one hand, I think people are already worried. On the other hand, I think, people in the space, I think sometimes they feel it's like they feel a little bit like everybody is as concerned about these things as they are, and so they feel like, well, this development that's just happened is so significant, and everybody's going to figure it out and be understanding and concerned at that point. And I've seen a number of those developments come and go enough to sort of realize that they don't move the needle as much as you think. And Sputnik is famous for flying over the heads of Americans and supposedly motivating lots of people to be worried about the threat of missiles
Right.
from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And I think, that was a really tangible one. It actually didn't seem to move public opinion even itself immediately.
Right.
It required a kind of reaction at the elite level in combination with this Sputnik event that together changed people's thinking over time. And so I think, so when you're asking when is the public going to glom on, I think a lot of that has to do with when politicians and other leaders have sort of glommed on,
Mm,
and
mm,
when it becomes a sort of hot button issue on the political level,
mhm.
that will change people's thinking.
Now, politicians, and I'm not blaming them, right? Because they've got a lot on their plate, right? They've got a lot of issues and things they have to deal with all the time. So this isn't the blame game. But they tend to be reactive rather than proactive. And with AGI, is there going to be time to react? I mean, if a super intelligent computer
Yeah.
is developed and it gets beyond our capacity to control it, isn't reactive not an option? So
Well,
does that not
I
push
don't
you
think
in that
we
we
have to
have to be
go, I don't
proactive?
think, I agree with you. And I don't think we have to even think about AGI to talk about the need for anticipatory regulation. I
Right.
mean, even when it comes to things like AlphaFold,
Yeah.
AlphaFold, incredible technology that
Mhm.
is giving us these predictions about the folding of proteins. It's amazing, right? But what effects is it going to have? Is it going to have some potential risks out there when we think about the maybe new proteins that people will realize can do some new and interesting things. And so there's some risks involved
Yes.
when you develop a system like that, and if you just open source it, maybe that's the right decision. Science is important; it's having huge benefits to science,
Yeah.
so that's great. On the other hand, who should be making that decision? That's my point. Who should make the decision about whether to open source it or not?
Hmm.
It probably shouldn't be just some folks in one company that make these decisions if they're consequential and they have effects on all of us.
Yeah.
So I think we need anticipatory regulation. We need some sensible decisions to be made about what sorts of development can happen, what sorts of deployment can happen in advance of those things happening. And one of the things we did this trip I was on in China, we all agreed it was mostly AI scientists from China and the West,
Hmm.
and we all agreed that probably there should be a set of red lines that shouldn't be crossed in development.
Really?
But yeah, but those red lines are something that, fundamentally they have to be anticipatory. You don't want to be over the line and then say, that line, that was a shame that we crossed that line. We need to have approaches to governance that are anticipating where we're going.
Hmm. I'm very interested in your trip to China because in the book I talk about uh, China's regulations on AI and what they're putting forward. I look at the EU Act, right? I look at the UK summit and even Biden's executive order. How much control do does industry in China have over what functions versus what kind of government control is placed on that? What's the relationship like there between industry and government?
Well, as you might imagine, they have some more transparency, I think, into what their companies are doing,
Right.
and they have a lot of influence over those companies.
Mhm.
So it's different in the U.S. And actually in Britain, where I live. The governance of frontier AI is largely still voluntary. They're a voluntary set of commitments that
Right.
companies have been making. And in China, it's not as voluntary. If they wanted to have more control, they could exercise it. So that's a difference.
Is that a
It's a
good
different.
thing, a bad thing, a little of both?
Well, like anything else, I think I'm not here to compare all aspects of different systems,
Hmm.
but there's some there's some obvious and well-known drawbacks to greater levels of control. But when it comes to getting companies to do what you want them to do, there's some benefits.
Yeah, for sure. So in the world right now, we've got, Sam Altman and OpenAI, we've got DeepMind, we've got Anthropic, right? We have Meta. We have these companies, these big tech players racing ahead to try to develop AGI. Any thoughts on who you think is going to cross that finish line
Who's going to
first?
win? You want me to
Yeah.
horse race it?
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
uh, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. It depends. It depends a lot on those things we were saying before about what's required to get to some sort of general intelligence, whether
Right.
you can basically mostly get there in terms of building a world model. Can you do that by just scaling up data and
Yeah.
compute?
Because
Well,
some would disagree, right? Some would say unless you have embodiment, right? You have to have right a kind of an
yeah,
evolutionary
yeah,
aspect of it for it to become,
yeah,
general intelligence. So you're talking about
yeah,
something happening in a box
Yeah.
whereas humans don't exist in a box. We interact with the world. So some think the
Yeah.
whole model of scaling up will lead to no general intelligence whatsoever unless you embody this thing into robotics
Yeah.
or that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of that to me is a debate about it's a debate about what we mean by intelligence in a way.
Right.
Because there's one metaphor that some of the folks who don't believe we're sort of on a path to AGI through scaling up use. They say, suppose you go into a library and you don't speak one word of anything in this huge library. Can you ever really understand this language? If you have no points of connection, there's nothing to tell you what these words reference out there in the real world. Can you ever really understand this language especially if what all you have access to is kind of statistics? So you can statistically predict that, okay, this phrase is likely to follow that phrase or something
Right.
like that,
Right.
you
Right.
know? And so their point is, no, you can't. And that's exactly what these language models are doing. So they have
Mm.
no real understanding. They have no real intelligence.
Hmm.
And I have to say that I draw exactly I think it's a great metaphor, but I draw exactly the opposite conclusion. Because to me, what one of the real, uh, frankly, surprises, because I did not believe it. I did not expect it, did not believe it. But the surprises of the last couple of years is that even before we had multimodal models, when we just had large language models, just analyzing language in that way can give you a more accurate world model
Mm.
than I would have thought was possible.
And that's a form of intelligence.
Well, I don't want to debate whether
Yeah.
that's a form of intelligence because people have different views about what intelligence is.
Okay.
And what I want to say is it's built a model of the world that allows it to operate or could allow it to operate right now very imperfectly allows it to operate in human worlds.
Mm.
But even that is an absolute shock to me. In fact, these people say, oh, we don't have to worry because it's doing this thing with this library and this language that it doesn't understand. My conclusion is exactly the opposite. And
Mm.
that has made me worry more because of the extraordinary ability of these vast systems to learn in a context where, from a human perspective, they shouldn't have been able to learn.
Right. Right. Now, since the 50s, since the Dartmouth conference and whatnot, AI has gone through some what we call seasons or, summers and winters and
Yes,
summers
it
and
has.
winters. And we're back on a summer now. It's kind of going up. It doesn't look like the summer is going to end, though. It really feels like this is a different time in history where we've never had this type of AI tech before. And so I'm just wondering, uh, are we at that point, a very unique point in human history, where a lot is going to change fairly rapidly in terms of what AI is about to bring to the world? Do you feel like we're in a kind of a unique point in history?
I mean, I think when we say unique point, it's sort of like unique with respect to what? And I'm sort of I hear when you say that, I hear all these other instances where people throughout history have said, now we're at the turning point.
Yeah.
I think about Hegel, who said the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, and dusk is now. And
Yeah.
I figured it out. I've understood all of history because
Oh,
history is ending now
the
with
humble
me.
Hegel.
And
Yes.
that's right. And Francis Fukuyama was a later version of that. And so, but there's lots of other examples. But so so I'm a little bit hesitant to
Mhm.
to make claims about unique moment and this sort of thing. But on the other hand, I'm sympathetic to the to some of those claims in terms of the possibility because I guess I do think I think right now the AI that we have has severe limitations.
Mm.
Severe limitations. If it plateaus where it is, I think it will have still significant economic effects. It will have important effects, but I won't say that I wouldn't probably use the term unique then.
Okay.
I would say, oh, it was a significant technology that was invented, had some impacts on the world. But so I think the question is it going to really go someplace new where it isn't now? And a big part of that question is, are we going to have planning agents? Are we going to have agents that can make long-term plans that are better than the long-term plans that we can make? And if we do, then I think that is a pretty big deal. Pretty big deal. Now we know that, these some agents in two-person zero-sum contexts, like Go and like chess and other areas where even if you just have two teams and it's zero-sum, AI can beat humans in those cases. But isn't necessarily superhuman in other cases where we have multiple agents and we have a more complicated environment. It's not necessarily superhuman in those cases. I mean, if you look at like the Cicero system, for instance, that was trying to analyze the game of diplomacy, where it's amazing, right? You have people actually talking to each other, and some of them are talking unknowingly to an AI system. They couldn't reveal, by the way, that it was an AI system, because if they did, then it was clear that everybody was going to gang up on it. So they didn't reveal it. Anyway, they trained a system in this context, and in a way, it's amazing that they could do this. And it was a real, you can call it a triumph for the team at Meta that managed to do this.
Right.
But on the other hand, in this competition that it engaged in, it wasn't superhuman. It didn't do better than everybody else. So the state of the art right now is not at all superhuman when it comes to complicated multi-person, multi-agent environments. But it doesn't seem so unlikely that it will be pretty soon. And I think that'll be a new thing.
And based on that, how might AI tools change the power distribution across major nation state players, like culturally, politically, even militarily? How do you see a shift in world
Well, these
power distribution?
technologies are dual use. So if you have an agent that can do everything as well as or better than a human, it's going to have some military implications.
For sure.
I think it's pretty speculative to think about what those are going to be and which are going to be the most important. But I think we can be pretty sure that militaries and states are going to feel like it likely will and be pretty interested in that. I don't know the answer in terms of what's going to happen on the
none of us
military
do.
side. Something's going to happen. That much we know.
Yes. And on that note, when I was trying to build my machine god back in the 90s, I drafted up a rough type of constitution or accord that I thought the UN might want to adopt for all nation states to get on board in terms of regulation and function. Do you foresee the development of an international governance body over AI, something that actually has teeth that can actually bring about consequences?
I think that we need to have forms of international governance. I think we will need that. I think there's a lot of energy now at the international level. There's a lot of discussion in different forums about forms of international governance. And I think there's likely to be some that we will stumble towards. There's a question about how quickly. It's very easy to try and have international governance and just not to get very far with it. An example of that, in fact, that is closely related is the lethal autonomous weapons discussions at the UN has the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. Great. You got to love the titles. Convention on Certain Conventional. Anyway, it's it's been more than a decade now that there have been discussions there, and there haven't been the sorts of positive law developments that the advocates of limiting lethal autonomous weapons were hoping for. So
Hmm.
just having the conversation is no guarantee that it's going to go in a terribly productive governance direction.
Right. I'm wondering,
But
is the
yeah, go ahead.
importance of it, is the power of AI, and the development thereof with these big tech companies in other countries. We saw the development of the International Atomic Energy Agency, with weaponry and energy. Will we see something similar? Will a country like the US just take the initiative and say, okay, we're going to develop this organization, and we're going to monitor what everybody in the world is doing with AI, because if we don't, you know, we all sink or we all swim, together here. So will there be an event maybe in the future, where like a go event or something, where countries say, you know, it looks like the excrement has really hit the oscillator on this one, and we really need to move and create something. Do you foresee like an International Atomic Energy Agency type of organization?
Well, well, first of all, I think, we need to talk a little bit about what the International Atomic Energy Agency really does.
Okay.
Because what it really does is it has a development mandate, but it is in the sense that you're talking about it, it's enforcing the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right.
So it's not actually a monitoring organization. It's not going into NORAD
Right.
in the United States, not really. It's not enforcing a kind of oversight and regulatory regime on the nuclear powers,
Hmm.
fundamentally. I mean, not primarily doing that. So the point is that we have never really done the sort of thing that you're talking about.
Right.
And I think we need to be sort of straight with ourselves about that. There was an attempt to do that, and that attempt failed.
Hmm.
There was an attempt called the Baruch Plan, following on from the Acheson-Lilienthal report,
Hmm.
to internationalize nuclear weapons. And this was at a moment you'd had a pretty big Sputnik moment. You'd had
Yeah.
nuclear bombs actually go off. You had Bertrand Russell writing a book called Will Man Survive? And scientists quoting the Bhagavad Gita, and people talking on the floor of the British Parliament about existential risk. It was a moment when, if the world were ever going to be galvanized to work together on a universal governance solution, that maybe was the moment.
Right.
And they didn't do it in spite of it. So I think, we need to be sort of clear-eyed about that. I think, there are forms of international governance that I think we did evolve and we can still evolve. And it may be at some point in the future that we'll have a technology, or we'll expect a technology that means we have to do something. We as a world have to do something that we've never done before. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, serious people talked about, could we have a world without nuclear weapons? Henry Kissinger and George Mitchell and Schultz and others published a series of articles in the Wall Street Journal talking about how could we get to a world without nuclear weapons. And people thought a lot about that. It's a really hard problem, and they get into all kinds of details about the time to, what they call it, the time to breakout. Breakout means if somebody tries to do covertly develop a nuclear weapon, how long does it take for them to do it? And then that's breakout. So, that was, and the question was, what could you do to prevent it in that time? Could you have enough visibility and enough ability to react that you could make it not such a big deal if somebody tried to cheat? So that's what they thought about, because the key there was that you could never have even one failure. You had to have an agreement where you could be sure that it would never, ever fail. Now, a lot of international agreements, it's assumed, in fact, it's designed in many cases into international agreements that they have the ability to fail sometimes, and even allow some actors to essentially violate the agreement in some cases and have the regime keep going. But this is a case where you wouldn't have that. So let me say one more thing about this. So because I think it's a helpful way to think about it. So what we've done before in terms of limiting nuclear weapons are things between the major powers, are things like, okay, we're going to limit each side to a certain number of deployed nuclear weapons. So what happens then if somebody cheats and they build a little bit more of a nuclear weapon? Does that revolutionize the balance of power? Not really, probably. I mean, some of the guys in the nuclear space, they get really excited about these things, and they'll tell you, oh, it'd be a huge deal if somebody cheated on the START treaty or whatever. But fundamentally, it doesn't. But now compare that world, which is the world that we have, to the world where we've limited all the nations of the world to 0 nuclear weapons. And now suppose one of them cheats. So they build a few nuclear weapons. Well, that overturns the balance of power. So the sorts of monitoring and verification regimes that we need in that second world are totally different than what we need in the first world. And when we're talking about an agreement on a technology that states think is maybe fundamental to their security and to their commercial interests, we're talking about something that if they're limiting their development of it, maybe it's a little bit more like that world of 0 nuclear weapons, where they would have to be sure they couldn't ever have a failure, than it is about the world with the START treaty. And once you realize that, you realize 2 things. Number one, this is something that serious people have talked about doing, so it isn't something that we should just throw up our hands and say is absolutely impossible. But number 2, it's something that as a world we have never done before, and there's a reason for that. It is not easy to do.
Right. Now, on that note, in the book I'm finishing now, the final chapter deals with what the public can do regarding AI governance, because I do predict that there's going to be this feeling of what's going on, and it doesn't seem like we have much control over what's happening in the world. Do you have any recommendations for our viewers and listeners regarding how they might feel more empowered in dealing with AI developments?
How they might feel more empowered. Oh, that's
Yeah,
such a
what can they
good,
do? Can they contact their, senators, their
yeah.
politicians, their MPs?
Yeah, it's great. It's great. I think we need collective, we need social movements
Hmm.
that will help people to feel empowered, where they can feel like they're a part of a movement and they're getting together with others and they're having a voice and things. I think after World War II, for instance, there was the UN organization, not just the UN, but there was the UN organization of people that got together and felt like they were sort of participating in international governance and helping to kind of think about a new world order, which hopefully would have less conflict. So
Right.
I think those organizations play a big role. I think about that one because my grandmother actually, I think maybe her proudest moment of her life, perhaps, and I have a wonderful picture of it. She was inspired by that organization, and she actually convinced more people to join it than anybody else.
Oh, wow.
And so she got an award from Eleanor Roosevelt for doing this, which I say is her proudest moment, because the smile on her face as she's getting that award is so broad and so bright. But yeah, I don't know. I think those sorts of social movements that collectively help to give people a voice would are important. They're important to people psychologically. They're important in terms of the impact that they have, but they're also important just because they really do allow people to have a voice collectively.
No, for sure. No. Yeah. Now, much of your research involves empirical explanations of the mechanics of peace. And this is a little off of the AI train of thought, but um, it's always good to talk to political scientists about what's happening in the world right now. Um, I can ask you your thoughts about uh, Russia and Ukraine and Hamas and Israel. Some easy,
Oh
easy
boy.
topics to discuss. And wondering, you know, what is an expert's opinion? I can hear the average person's opinions anytime, but what are your thoughts? How do you think these are gonna play out?
Oh gosh, how are they going to play out? You're asking me to predict the future too. I love it.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
love it. Um, well, you know, I'm not I'm not too hopeful in either case. So they're
Right.
both sort of sad topics to talk about. And I suppose with respect to the first, I would express the following sort of cynicism. A couple of years ago, there was a meeting between Vladimir Putin and the leader of Japan,
Mhm.
and the Japanese leader to surprise Putin, and he said, "Why don't we develop a settlement of these islands that are in dispute between Russia and Japan? Why don't we just settle that and figure it out? We can do it. We're the leaders. We can do it." And Putin is taken aback and doesn't know quite how to respond. And what he says is, well, this is very interesting. Maybe we can do it. Maybe we can come up with a solution where nobody feels like a loser.
Mm.
That was how it was translated. But I think that's just about a direct quote. And I sort of feel it's similar in the case of Ukraine, very, very sadly. But I think leaders don't like to admit defeat.
Right.
And so if you've taken a step, particularly invasion, then you're not, as a leader, it's going to be tough to admit that you haven't achieved goals.
Hmm.
You need to be able to claim some sort of victory, at least um, many leaders do. And so that's a question. Will there be a way for Russia to claim a victory? If there is not that way, then I think there will be continued conflict. And on the other hand, will Ukraine ever at this point stop fighting without achieving its territorial integrity again? Well, of course, it depends on the military balance, but I'm not very hopeful there either. So I think it's pretty hard to see how, um, at least without tremendous burden of costs, that the sides are going to achieve a peace there at this point. Now, you want me to talk about Israel and Hamas too? Oh my goodness.
Yes, putting you on the hot seat.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I think a lot there will depend on the political dynamics within Israel, I think. We'll see what happens there. Um, you know, as far as I can tell, the left that used to exist in Israel doesn't really exist in the same way anymore.
Hmm.
And I personally think that's very sad for Israel and sad for everybody, really. Um, whether a new social movement can arise and resist the sort of Netanyahu approach, I think is the question now.
Yeah. Right. Right. No no easy solutions to something with so many moving parts, right? So
No, it's a terrible human tragedy.
it is. It is. It is. At any point in the future, do you think I wanted to build a super intelligent computer to help politicians make better policy decisions because it could present more accurate facts, and it could work out things that it takes humans forever, so much longer to think about. Do you foresee, I'll leave this as the last question for you. Do you see advancements in AI being utilized for the benefit of countries in making better political decisions within their own state, nation states, and globally as well?
Oh, absolutely. I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of potential for the development of agents that help us to plan and help us to make better decisions in general. There's a big part of international relations theory
Mhm.
that has the view that war is often caused by a lack of information and a misevaluation of what the other side can do and is willing to do.
Interesting.
And so, to the extent that we can really improve our decision making and our analysis capabilities, I think there's a lot of potential benefit there. And there are some significant potential costs too. I never like to talk about the intersection of military and AI because I
Mm.
guess I don't want to give people ideas. But I think, when we think about the impact that AI could have on the nuclear balance and things like that, there are some areas that are really worrying too, really worrying. And Yeah, we have a lot of things to work out. You and I and everybody else. We need more people to come into this area
Yes,
because we need a lot of help. There's a lot to figure out.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it looks like we individually and collectively have our work cut out for us. So, on that note, I'll thank you for joining me today and talking about these issues in AI and about global governance. And I look forward to seeing what kind of research you're doing in the future. And thanks again for joining me today. I really appreciate that.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here, Christopher, and I'm glad to hear about your book. Also, looking forward to learning more about that, and some of these books that you have behind on the bookshelf here also look very interesting. I've been thinking as we were talking, I have to look one or two of them up. So, a couple of titles there that I probably shouldn't mention on the air, but
Oh, yeah, it's quite all right.
thanks so
Well,
much for inviting me, and thanks for the conversation.
my pleasure. Thank you. I really appreciate it.